José Gonzalo Rodríguez Gacha. There was a man in Colombia who loved Mexico so much that he named his ranches after Mexican towns, hired mariachi bands to play at his parties, and earned the nickname El Mexicano without ever once being Mexican. He also happened to be one of the most feared killers the cocaine trade ever produced. By the time the United States government put him on its most wanted list, they had frozen $61.8 million of his money across 5 different countries, and they still could not lay a hand on him. To understand how a poor boy who sold pigs and cheese became a man worth billions, you have to go back to the emerald mines of Boyaca. Gacha was born on May 14, 1947, into a family with almost nothing. He had little formal education, but he had a talent that the violent world around him valued highly. He could kill, and he was not squeamish about it. He started as an enforcer in the brutal Emerald Wars under a man known as the Emerald Tsar, and there he built the reputation that would define the rest of his life. Long before cocaine made him rich, the men of Boyaca already knew not to cross him. When he moved into the drug trade, he brought that reputation with him. He joined forces with the Ochoa family, with Pablo Escobar, and with Carlos Leder, and together they formed what the world would come to know as the Medellin Cartel. Gacha became the military wing. If Escobar was the face of the operation, Gacha was the fist. He was the man they called when a problem needed to disappear permanently, and he took to the role with a coldness that unsettled even the people who worked beside him. Some in the cartel reportedly considered him the most violent of all of them, which, given the company he kept, is saying something. His real innovation, though, was industrial. Deep in the jungle of Caqueta, he helped build a cocaine processing complex called Tranquilandia, a sprawling facility where more than 2,000 people lived and worked. It was less a drug lab than a small city dedicated to a single product, with its own living quarters, its own supply lines, and its own internal economy. When Colombian police and the American DEA finally raided it in March of 1984, they destroyed the laboratory and seized 13.8 metric tons of cocaine, worth an estimated $1.2 billion. It was the largest seizure of its kind anywhere in Latin America to that point, and it gave the rest of the world its first real glimpse of the scale these men were operating at. That scale was almost impossible to picture. Forbes magazine listed Gacha among the richest people on the planet in 1988. He owned more than 100 properties across Colombia, valued in the tens of billions of pesos. He hired Israeli and British mercenaries, including a retired Israeli lieutenant colonel, to train his assassins in the techniques of professional soldiers. And he poured his fortune into paramilitary death squads that spread terror far beyond the drug world, into the world of Colombian politics itself. And somehow, it gets worse. More than 1,000 deaths were attributed to him. He ordered the assassination of the president of a left-wing political party in 1987. He took part in the killing of a leading presidential candidate in August of 1989, a murder that shook the entire country. Colombian intelligence held him and Escobar responsible for a truck bombing at the National Security Headquarters in December of that year that killed 63 people and wounded more than 600. And in a detail that captures exactly who he was, he murdered his old mentor, the same Emerald Tsar who had given him his first job, along with 16 other people, in a single act of betrayal. The Americans wanted him badly. A grand jury in Florida charged him with running a continuing criminal enterprise, and the prosecutor described the indictment as covering a 15-year span and the importation of 44,000 pounds of cocaine worth $1 billion. He called the case a series of snapshots of a long-term drug conspiracy in action. A second indictment in New York accused Gacha of heroin trafficking and money laundering, and he reportedly threatened a New York mayor and a former federal prosecutor who would later become famous in his own right. Gacha landed on the United States Attorney General's so-called Dirty Dozen list of most wanted traffickers, and the government moved to freeze his assets across 5 countries at once. But in the end, it was not the Americans who got him. It was a betrayal from inside the underworld itself. A rival informant planted by the Cali organization fed his location to authorities, tracking him from Cartagena down to the Caribbean coast near Tolu. On December 15, 1989, 22 police officers, 17 of them elite commandos, descended in 2 armed helicopters and assaulted his compound. Gacha and his 17-year-old son fled in a red pickup truck across the open ground. A machine gun mounted on one of the helicopters cut them both down. The morgue director would later state plainly that the cause of death was the destruction of the brain. A police major announced that they had killed El Mexicano along with his son and a group of his bodyguards near Tolu, and a major American newspaper called it the most striking success in Colombia's entire war on the traffickers. He had built an empire on fear and on murder, and in the end, the same shadow world he ruled handed him over for the price of a single tip. But Gacha was only 1/3 of the Medellin alliance, and the partner who reshaped how cocaine actually reached American soil was stranger than any of them. He admired Adolf Hitler, built a statue of John Lennon, and turned a tiny Caribbean island into the busiest smuggling hub in the hemisphere. Carlos Leder. Picture an island in the Bahamas, barely 200 miles off the coast of Florida, with its own runway, its own radar, and Doberman pinschers patrolling the beaches. Now picture the man who owned it twice offering to pay off the entire national debt of Colombia, building a statue of John Lennon, and openly praising Adolf Hitler in the same breath. That man was Carlos Leder, and he changed cocaine smuggling forever by asking one simple question: why use people to carry the drugs when you can use airplanes? Leder was born on September 7, 1949, in Armenia, Colombia, to a German immigrant father and a Colombian mother. That dual heritage gave him German citizenship, a small detail that would matter enormously decades later. He began at the bottom, as a car thief and a marijuana smuggler in the United States, and he eventually landed in a federal prison in Connecticut. For a lesser man, that would have been a dead end. Leder treated it as a business school. There he met an American smuggler named George Jung, and the two of them studied the economics of cocaine the way other men studied for parole. By the time he walked free, he had a plan. What Leder understood was logistics. The old way of moving cocaine relied on human couriers swallowing or carrying small amounts taped to their bodies, which was slow and tiny in scale. Leder's idea was to move it by air, in bulk, using a forward base close to American shores. From 1978, he took over Norman's Cay, a Bahamian island roughly 210 miles off Florida, and transformed it into a private smuggling fortress. He built a 3,300-foot runway, hangars, and a radar system, and he bribed Bahamian officials all the way to the top. At its peak, as much as 300 kilograms of cocaine moved through that island in a single day. He had essentially built a private airport that existed only to flood the United States with cocaine. The money was staggering. Estimates of his earnings ran as high as $300 million a year. He offered more than once to pay off Colombia's entire national debt, which tells you exactly how he saw himself, not as a criminal, but as a power equal to a government. He bought hotels, land, and influence, and he carried himself like a man who believed the ordinary rules had stopped applying to him. And this is where the story stops being just about drugs. Leder was openly obsessed with Adolf Hitler, He founded a fascist political movement in his home region of Quindio that drew more than 10,000 followers, and he campaigned hard against the treaty that would allow Colombia to extradite its citizens to the United States. He saw extradition as the single greatest threat to men like him, and he spent real money fighting it. At the very same time, he idolized John Lennon and built a statue of him at his hotel, a monument to peace standing in the middle of a smuggling empire. You would think someone would have said something about the contradiction. Nobody did. Later was not only a smuggler and a would-be politician, he was also a founding member of a paramilitary group that the cartel bosses formed after a left-wing guerrilla group attempted to kidnap one of them, an organization built to strike back at anyone who threatened the traffickers or their families. So at the same time that he was financing a peace statue and an air bridge of cocaine, he was helping bankroll armed men whose entire purpose was retaliation. It was all of a piece with how Later operated. He wanted to be feared, admired, and untouchable all at once, and for a few years, he very nearly was. His downfall began with attention. An American news network aired an exposé on the corruption at Norman's Cay in 1983, and Later went into hiding. Then he made a fatal enemy. He fell out with Pablo Escobar, reportedly after killing one of Escobar's own hitmen, and many people believe it was Escobar himself who quietly gave up Later's location to authorities. On February 4, 1987, he was captured near the town of Guarne. What happened next was historic. Later became the first Colombian ever extradited to the United States under the very treaty he had fought so hard to defeat. He was flown to Florida within hours of his capture, before anyone could intervene or buy his way out. The prosecution team included a young lawyer named Robert Mueller, who would one day run the FBI. Later was convicted in May of 1988 of conspiring to ship more than 3 tons of cocaine, and the judge handed him a sentence almost beyond comprehension: life without parole, plus an additional 135 years. That should have been the end of him. But in 1991, Later testified against the former Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega, and in exchange his sentence was cut down to 55 years. He served 33 of them. In 2020, he was quietly released and deported to Germany, the country whose citizenship his father had passed down to him half a century earlier. In 2024, he published a memoir, placing much of the blame for the cartel's violence squarely on Escobar's shoulders. He even briefly returned to Colombia in early 2025, where he was detained at the Bogotá airport and then released days later when a judge found that his old warrants had quietly lapsed. The man who built an empire in the sky had outlived almost everyone he started with. But while Later and the Medellin men waged open war on the Colombian state, a very different kind of operation was quietly taking over the cocaine business from the city of Cali. Its leader did not think of himself as a gangster at all. He thought of himself as a chess player. Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela. There is a kind of criminal who shoots his way to the top, and there is a kind who calculates his way there. Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela was the second kind. They called him the chess player, and while Escobar was blowing up airplanes and waging open war on a government, Gilberto was quietly building a cocaine operation so vast and so disciplined that American prosecutors would one day compare its capture to the hunt for the most wanted terrorist on Earth. At its peak, his organization controlled roughly 80% of the cocaine reaching the United States. He started about as far from a billionaire as a person can get. Born in late January of 1939, Gilberto went to work at 13 years old as a delivery boy for a pharmacy, where he learned to cut corners and quietly inflate prices. By 25, he owned his own drugstore. That instinct for business never left him. and it became the single thing that separated the Cali cartel from every other organization in the trade. He was a merchant first and a criminal second, and he ran cocaine the way a careful man runs a chain of stores. In the late 1960s, Gilberto, his younger brother Miguel, and a partner named José Santa Cruz Londono founded a gang that made its early money through kidnapping, including the ransom of 2 Swiss citizens for around $700,000. That seed money built the foundation of the Cali cartel. By 1975, Gilberto was already exporting cocaine hidden inside hollowed wooden planks, shipped out of the port of Buenaventura. He earned his nickname for precisely this reason. He thought several moves ahead, while his rivals simply reacted to whatever was in front of them, and that patience let him outlast men far more violent than himself. What made Cali different was that it operated like a corporation. Gilberto built a web of legitimate businesses to hide and launder the money, including a pharmacy chain with more than 400 stores and around 4,000 employees, a laboratory company, a radio network, a bank in Panama, and even a professional football club. The cartel maintained an intelligence apparatus that reportedly put as many as 5,000 Cali taxi drivers on the payroll, so that almost no one could move through the city without the organization knowing about it within minutes. They had effectively turned an entire city into a surveillance system. The reach of all this was almost hard to believe. At its mid-1990s peak, the Cali cartel controlled not only around 80% of the cocaine entering the United States, but roughly 90% of the market in Europe as well. They were no longer simply a Colombian organization. They were a global supplier, with distribution cells planted in cities across 2 continents and a bookkeeping operation sophisticated enough to track it all. Where Escobar wanted to be seen, Gilberto wanted to be invisible, and for a long time invisibility worked far better than fame ever had. The DEA administrator at the time called it the most powerful criminal organization in the world and said that no drug operation rivaled it then or perhaps at any time in history. One prosecutor described Cali as the Walmart of the drug world. That is the level we are talking about. They smuggled cocaine inside hollow lumber, inside concrete fence posts, inside chlorine cylinders, and even inside shipments of frozen broccoli and okra. There seemed to be no object they could not turn into a hiding place. All of that legitimate business served a single purpose. It let the cartel wash enormous amounts of drug money through ordinary commerce, so that the cash flowing out of American streets reappeared as pharmacy receipts and football salaries and bank deposits in Panama. To the public, the Rodriguez brothers were respectable businessmen, philanthropists even, pillars of the city of Cali. Behind that respectable face sat the largest cocaine operation the world had ever seen. That gap between the public image and the private reality was the whole point, and it was exactly what made Gilberto so difficult to catch. The investigation that finally cracked the operation began in 1991, when a single shipment of concrete posts revealed 12,000 kilograms of cocaine hidden inside. American agents named the effort Operation Cornerstone. Gilberto had been arrested before, once in Spain back in the 1980s, but he had always managed to slip back to Colombia and resume control. This time the net was built differently, and it was built to hold. He was captured on June 9, 1995. And here is where the chess player nearly won one final time. He was released on a legal technicality in 2002, walking out of prison as though the entire case had evaporated. But the Americans were not finished with him. He was rearrested in 2003, and in December of 2004, he was finally extradited to the United States. In 2006, he pleaded guilty in Miami to conspiracy to import cocaine and to money laundering. He and his brother together forfeited $2.1 billion, and each of them received 30 years. The federal prosecutor who handled the case compared the moment to the capture of the world's most hunted terrorist, saying it simply did not get any bigger than this. For a man who had spent his entire life thinking several moves ahead, there was finally no move left to make. Gilberto died on May 31, 2022, of cancer, inside a federal prison in North Carolina, at the age of 83, after being denied compassionate release 2 years earlier. The strategist who had outmaneuvered everyone ended his life in a cell, far from the city he once controlled. The chess player handled strategy, the long game, the wider picture. But every empire that size needs someone obsessed with the details, someone who watches every shipment and counts every dollar. In Cali, that man was his own younger brother, and his appetite for control would eventually put the very words that convicted him onto government recordings. Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela. If Gilberto was the brain of the Cali cartel, his younger brother Miguel was its nervous system. They called him the Master, and his obsession was control. He wanted to know where every kilo of cocaine was sitting, where every dollar had gone, and who every person in the operation was talking to. That obsession made him brilliant at hiding drugs, and it also handed prosecutors the exact evidence they needed to put him away. Miguel could not stop talking on the phone, and the government was listening to every word he said. Born in 1943, 4 years after Gilberto, Miguel grew up alongside his brother in the same world of hustle and ambition. But where Gilberto floated above the daily operation, dealing in strategy and the big picture, Miguel lived down inside it. He was the hands-on manager, the one who personally oversaw production, transport, wholesale distribution, and the laundering of money every single day. He earned the nickname the Master for his sheer inventiveness, for the endless creative ways he devised to conceal cocaine and slip it past the authorities. If Cali had 1,000 hiding places, most of them lived in Miguel's head. That same micromanaging instinct became his undoing. Miguel was notorious for spending hours at a time on the phone, dictating instructions, checking on shipments, running the empire by voice from morning until night. Those calls generated exactly the kind of wiretap evidence that would later prove fatal in an American courtroom. The very thing that made him a master of the business made him an open book to the people hunting him. Every order he gave was another sentence the prosecution could one day read aloud. Miguel's world was not as bloodless as the cartel's corporate reputation suggested. Cali presented itself as the businessmen of the trade, the rational alternative to Escobar's bombs, and to a degree that image was earned. But behind it sat a fierce and sometimes violent fight for territory, especially over the lucrative distribution market in New York, and the organization was tied to the murders of people who got in its way, including journalists. The suits and the spreadsheets were real. So was the willingness to kill to protect them. His influence reached far beyond cocaine. Miguel allegedly financed much of a massive political scandal in Colombia, with roughly $6 million in Cali money funneled into a presidential campaign in 1994. When that connection surfaced, it nearly broke the Colombian government and confirmed what many people had quietly feared, that the cartel's reach extended directly into the highest office in the country. For a moment, it looked as though the traffickers had not just corrupted the system, but purchased it outright. To understand Miguel, it helps to picture the difference between the two brothers in a single room. Gilberto would decide where the organization should be in 5 years. Miguel would decide which truck left the warehouse that afternoon. He trusted almost no one with the details, because in his mind, the details were the business, and a single careless shipment could bring the whole structure down. For years, that paranoia kept him safe, in the end, it was the thing that buried him. Miguel was arrested on August 6, 1995, only a couple of months after his brother. But arrest did not mean the empire stopped running. And no, I am not making that up. The brothers simply kept directing the organization from behind bars, using Miguel's son to relay orders and manage operations on the outside. For a while, prison was just a change of address, and the cocaine kept moving as though nothing had happened at all. That arrangement could not last forever. The Americans indicted the brothers in Miami in 2003, and the pressure on the entire family mounted month by month. Miguel's son eventually agreed to forfeit around $300 million in assets, pleaded guilty, and agreed to testify against his own father and his uncle. The empire that the brothers had spent decades building was now being dismantled from the inside, by their own blood. The case against Miguel was built, fittingly, out of his own voice. American and Colombian investigators had spent years assembling recordings, financial records, and the testimony of people inside the organization, and the picture they put together was overwhelming. The man who had tried to control every detail of the business had left a detailed record of nearly all of it. By the time it reached a courtroom, there was very little left for him to deny. Miguel was extradited in March of 2005, described at the time as the last of the great cartel barons to be brought to the United States. In 2006, he pleaded guilty, and in court he apologized to the people of the United States, saying that the words came from the bottom of his heart. He was sentenced to 30 years. The Justice Department called the brothers' guilty pleas the final fatal blow to the Cali cartel. By the time the dust settled, Operation Cornerstone had documented hundreds of thousands of kilograms of cocaine and more than $2 billion in proceeds. Miguel remains today inside a United States federal prison, quietly serving out the remainder of his sentence. The two brothers from Cali had built something Escobar never managed, a criminal enterprise that ran with the discipline of a Fortune 500 company. And yet they ended up in exactly the same place as the men who chose bullets over boardrooms, extradited, convicted, and locked away on American soil. The corporate cartel and the war cartel both lost to the very same weapon. But the men who ran Cali were not its only faces, and one of the others would prove that even a so-called business organization had a side capable of breathtaking violence. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Helmer Pacho Herrera. Of the four men who ran the Cali cartel, one stood apart in a way that nobody in that world expected. He was openly gay in a culture built on machismo. He wore stylish sportswear and traveled with a leather-clad biker entourage, and he was personally responsible for funneling tens of millions of dollars into the war to destroy Pablo Escobar. He was also the man who controlled the cartel's most important market, the streets of New York City. And in the end, the thing that killed him was not the police, and it was not Escobar. It was a man pretending to be a lawyer. Helmer Herrera, known to everyone as Pacho, was born on August 24, 1951, in Palmyra, in the Valle del Cauca. Before he ever touched cocaine, he worked in New York as a jewelry broker, learning the city and the people who moved money through it. By the time he was a young man, he had already drawn the attention of American authorities, with arrests on record in the 1970s. He was the youngest of Cali's four godfathers, and in a hyper-masculine underworld, he never hid who he was. That alone made him a kind of legend. From the early 1980s, Pacho carved out the role that would make him indispensable. He negotiated the rights to distribute cocaine in New York, and he built the smuggling routes that carried it there, including a working relationship with one of the most powerful traffickers in Mexico. He ran his network in layers, a web of cells across New York, each one overseen by its own manager, so that no single arrest could unravel the whole thing. He earned so much money for the organization that the Rodriguez brothers made him a full partner rather than an employee. He had become too valuable to be anything less. But Pacho was not only the smooth distributor that the cartel's corporate image suggested. He ran its most brutal enforcement wing, the part of the operation that handled violence when violence was required. And when the war against Escobar erupted, Pacho put his own fortune behind it. He reportedly invested around $30 million to finance the vigilante group that hunted Escobar and everyone close to him. Escobar understood exactly who was paying for the men trying to kill him, and he struck back. Pacho survived 2 separate mass casualty assassination attempts blamed on Escobar. One attack at a football field killed 18 people. Another killed 17. Pacho walked away from both. There was a strange duality to Pacho that made him hard to place. To the men he worked with, he could be generous and charming, a host who threw lavish parties and surrounded himself with style. To anyone who crossed the organization, he was something else entirely. He understood, better than most, that the Cali cartel's reputation for being businesslike was useful precisely because it was a disguise. The suits and the careful accounting hid an organization that would kill without hesitation, and Pacho ran the part of it that did the killing. By the early 1990s, the American net was closing. In 1991, the DEA launched an operation that used more than 100 court-authorized wiretaps against 2 of Herrera's New York cells at once. The result was devastating to his organization: nearly 100 arrests, more than 2.5 tons of cocaine seized, and $20 million taken. The market he had spent a decade building was being pulled apart, cell by cell, conversation by conversation. And no, the irony is not lost here. The same wiretaps that brought down so much of the Cali operation were aimed at a man who had always known the value of staying one step ahead. By 1996, with the other godfathers already falling and an American extradition request looming over him, Pacho made a calculated choice. Because his crimes predated a key change in Colombian law, he was shielded from being sent to the United States if he surrendered at home. So on September 1st, 1996, he turned himself in to the Colombian authorities, the last of the 4 Cali leaders to be taken. He was sentenced to a relatively short term, and he settled into prison life, where he devoted himself to organizing football among the inmates. He should have been safe there. He was not. On November 4th, 1998, a man arrived at the prison claiming to be a lawyer, using the name Rafael Uribe. He approached Pacho on the prison football pitch, the place where Pacho felt most at ease, and he opened fire, striking him in the head and the body several times. Pacho Herrera was 47 years old. The killing was widely blamed on a rival organization rising out of the wreckage of Cali, men who wanted to seize what was left of the empire and saw Pacho as the last obstacle. He had outlived Escobar, outlasted the wiretaps, and walked away from 2 attempts on his life, only to be killed by a stranger with a fake name on a soccer field he thought was his sanctuary. Pacho's death marked the true end of the old Cali order. But the cocaine trade did not die with the men of the 1990s. It mutated, and the man who would come to embody its next, even bloodier chapter, began his life not as a businessman or a smuggler, but as a teenage guerrilla in the jungles of northern Colombia. Dairo Antonio Usuga David. Some men reinvent themselves once. This man did it 3 times. He started as a teenage leftist guerrilla, switched sides to become a right-wing paramilitary, and then built the largest drug trafficking and paramilitary organization in modern Colombia. By the time the government finally cornered him, it took 500 Special Forces soldiers and more than 20 helicopters to bring in a single man with a fourth-grade education. The president of Colombia would call his capture the hardest blow against drug trafficking this century. Dairo Antonio Usuga David, known to the world by his alias Otoniel, was born on September 15, 1971, in Nacocli, in the Antioquia region, to a poor peasant family. School ended for him around the fourth grade. At 16 or 17, he joined a leftist guerrilla group, picking up a rifle before he was old enough to be considered an adult. When that group demobilized in the early 1990s, he did not put the rifle down. Instead, he crossed to the opposite side of Colombia's ideological war and joined the far-right paramilitaries, working under the organization's finance chief. He had learned that in the Colombian conflict, the side you fought for mattered far less than the willingness to keep fighting. After a paramilitary demobilization in 2005, Otoniel helped form a new organization out of the remnants, the group that came to be known as the Clan del Golfo, or the Gulf Clan. With his brother, he took control of it around 2009. When his brother was killed in a police raid in 2012, Otoniel became the supreme leader, the single most powerful criminal in the country. Under him, the Gulf Clan became something new and frightening. It operated like a franchise, taxing other criminal groups for the right to move cocaine through its territory, extending its reach across vast stretches of Colombia. American prosecutors would later describe him as the most significant and violent Colombian trafficker since Pablo Escobar. The numbers behind that description were staggering. Indictments accused him of smuggling at least 73 metric tons of cocaine into the United States over roughly a decade, and he would eventually admit to charges involving nearly 97,000 kilograms, more than 100 tons. And somehow, it gets worse. Otoniel did not just sell drugs. He ordered murders, torture, and kidnappings on a scale that terrorized whole regions. He offered cash bounties for the killing of police officers and soldiers, and he was held responsible for the deaths of more than 200 members of Colombia's security forces. He declared armed strikes that shut down whole regions through fear. He was also accused of grave abuses against children, the kind of charges that placed him among the most reviled men in the country. The president would call him not only a trafficker, but a destroyer of lives. What set the Gulf Clan apart from the cartels that came before it was how it governed. In the regions it controlled, Otoniel's organization did not simply traffic drugs. It acted like a shadow state, dictating who could move through an area, who could do business, and who would live or die. The armed strikes, he declared, could paralyze entire towns, with shops shuttered and roads emptied out of sheer terror. It was a return to the kind of raw territorial power that Colombia had hoped died with the old cartels, proof that the war everyone wanted to believe was over had simply changed its shape. Hunting him became a national mission. The DEA pursued him for nearly 20 years. The United States posted a reward of $5 million for information leading to his capture. Colombia launched a sprawling military operation against him, deploying thousands of troops over years, an effort so dangerous that a single search helicopter crash killed 18 people. For a long time, he simply vanished into the jungle, protected by loyal fighters and a population too frightened to talk. What finally undid him was his own body. Otoniel suffered from kidney disease, and the medication being delivered to treat it gave investigators the thread they needed. On October 23, 2021, In a massive operation involving more than 500 elite troops, over 20 helicopters, and intelligence support from the United States and Britain, they closed in and captured him alive. The president compared him directly to Escobar, calling him the most dangerous trafficker in the world and a murderer of police, of social leaders, and of children. His extradition on May 4, 2022, triggered a wave of retaliation. The Gulf Clan declared an armed strike that killed several people and saw more than 180 vehicles burned across the country, a final show of the terror he commanded even from a cell. In January of the following year, he pleaded guilty in a New York courtroom, admitting that tons of cocaine had moved at his direction. In August of 2023, he was sentenced to 45 years and ordered to forfeit $216 million. The American Attorney General said plainly that O'Toniel had led one of the largest cocaine trafficking organizations in the world and had ordered the ruthless execution of anyone who stood in his way. 3 lives, 1 ending. The guerrilla, the paramilitary, and the kingpin all arrived at the same 45-year sentence in a foreign prison. But to understand how the modern era even reached this point, you have to go back to one of the men who built the original Cali machine. A man who turned New York into a money-laundering laboratory and ordered a killing on American soil that crossed a line no cartel had crossed before. José Santa Cruz Londono. There is a kind of crime that shocks even a country numb to cartel violence. And in 1992, one of the founders of the Cali cartel committed it. He ordered the murder of a journalist, shot twice in the head in a restaurant in Queens, New York. It was the first time a drug cartel had ever ordered the killing of a journalist on American soil. The man who gave that order was José Santa Cruz Londono, and he ran the cartel's entire New York operation under a false name, hiding in plain sight in the largest city in the United States. Santa Cruz, known as Chepe, was born on October 1, 1943, in Cali. He was one of the original founders, building the early kidnapping gang and then the cartel itself alongside the Rodriguez brothers. He was said to have trained as an engineer, and that precision showed in how he worked. He became the cartel's man in New York, its nerve center in the United States, operating under the alias Victor Crespo. From there, he built a sophisticated machine for distributing cocaine and, just as importantly, for laundering the enormous amounts of cash it generated. His specialty was the invisible side of the business, the part that turned street money into clean money. He smuggled the chemicals needed to process cocaine, and he engineered elaborate methods to move both product and profit. In 1992, American agents seized 2 of his cocaine conversion laboratories in New York City itself, a sign of just how deeply embedded his operation had become in the city. Chepe had effectively planted the Cali cartel inside America's financial capital and run it like a quiet, well-managed firm. But the quiet ended with a murder. There was a Cuban-American journalist named Manuel de Dios Unanue, a former newspaper editor who had spent years investigating and exposing the cartels in print. He had made himself a target. On March 11, 1992, a gunman walked into a restaurant in Queens and shot him twice in the head. The order, prosecutors would later establish, came from the highest levels of the Cali cartel, from Chepe himself. The gunman received a life sentence, and several others were charged. The American prosecutor handling the case stated that the order had come from the very top of the organization. The journalist had not been killed for a single story. He had built a career out of naming names, publishing the identities and operations of cartel figures who depended on staying in the shadows. To a man like Chepe, whose entire value to the organization rested on remaining invisible, a reporter who dragged the cartel into print was not just an irritant. He was a threat to the whole model. The decision to silence him permanently was, in the cold logic of the business, treated as just another operational problem to solve. That killing changed things. You'd think someone would have warned the cartel that murdering a journalist in New York would bring down the full weight of the United States. Nobody could stop it, and the weight came. The De Dios murder turned Chepe from a faceless launderer into a marked man on 2 continents. Chepe was, in many ways, the engine room of the Cali cartel. While the Rodriguez brothers handled strategy and Pacho handled New York's streets, Chepe handled the machinery that made the money usable. Cocaine is worthless to a trafficker if the profits cannot be spent, and Chepe was the man who solved that problem on an industrial scale. He moved cash through layers of front companies and shell accounts, and he did it from inside the United States, where the risk was greatest and the reward largest. For years, he was the quietest of the founders, and that quiet was exactly what made him so effective. He was arrested on July 4th, 1995, in a restaurant in Bogotá, part of the same wave that swept up the Rodriguez brothers that year. But Chepe was not a man who accepted a cell quietly. On January 11th, 1996, he escaped from La Picota prison, slipping out through the interrogation room of a faceless prosecutor, one of the most brazen escapes in the cartel's history. For a few weeks he was free, and he tried to use that freedom to rebuild. He reached out to paramilitaries and even to leftist guerrillas, attempting to forge new alliances and reconstruct what was collapsing around him. It did not work. On March 5th, 1996, Colombian police killed him near Medellin. The official account described a shootout, but there is a competing version, one that has never been fully resolved, that holds he was actually captured, tortured, and executed by a paramilitary chief, working with a corrupt police officer, men who wanted him gone for their own reasons. The national police chief, asked about the death, said only that he was very happy and that it was a sign they were not letting their guard down. Which version is true may never be known for certain. Chepe had built an empire of clean money and run it from the heart of New York, and he died in a haze of conflicting stories on a road outside Medellin, his end as murky as the laundering schemes he once designed. But every story in this list, all the wars and the laboratories and the fortunes, traces back to one man, the one who started it all, who became the richest criminal in history, and who turned an entire nation into a battlefield. The king of cocaine, Pablo Escobar. At his peak, he was reportedly earning up to $420 million in a single week. His personal fortune was estimated at around $30 billion. He spent $2,500 a month just on rubber bands to hold his stacks of cash together, and he simply accepted that rats ate about 1/10 of his money every year because there was too much of it to store. This was Pablo Escobar, and for a time he was not just the most powerful criminal on earth. He was more powerful than the government of his own country. Escobar was born on December 1st, 1949, near Medellin. He began with petty crime, stealing tombstones and cars, before founding the Medellin Cartel in 1976. From there, his rise was almost vertical. At its height, his cartel controlled an estimated 80% of the global cocaine trade. Forbes magazine listed him among the richest people in the world for 7 consecutive years, and in 1989, it ranked him at number 20, with an estimated $3 billion in wealth that year alone. No criminal before or since has accumulated anything close to it. For a while, Escobar wanted more than wealth. He wanted legitimacy. He poured money into the poor neighborhoods of Medellin, building housing and football fields, handing out cash, cultivating an image as a man of the people. He even won a seat in the Colombian Congress as an alternate, dreaming of real political power. That dream died when a crusading justice minister exposed the source of his fortune and drove him out of public life. Escobar never forgave that humiliation, and the war he unleashed afterward was, in part, the revenge of a man who had been denied the one thing his money could not buy. But money was never really the point for Escobar. Power was. His method was simple and terrifying, and it had a name: plata o plomo, silver or lead. Take the bribe or take the bullet. Politicians, judges, and police officers across Colombia faced that exact choice. And when men refused the silver, Escobar delivered the lead on a scale the country had never seen. He ordered the assassination of a justice minister. He was behind the killing of a leading presidential candidate. He is believed to have ordered the bombing of a commercial airliner in November of 1989, an attack meant to kill a single political target that instead killed all 107 people aboard and 3 more on the ground. His hitman responsible for that bombing later received 10 consecutive life sentences. And somehow, it gets worse. Escobar put a bounty on the heads of police officers, and hundreds were killed as a result, with some estimates running into the many hundreds in Medellin alone. The total death toll attributed to him and his cartel is contested and enormous, with figures ranging from several thousand to numbers far higher. He waged open war on the Colombian state, bombing buildings and killing officials, all to force one single concession: that he would never be extradited to the United States. That fear, extradition, was the one thing Escobar could not bribe or bomb his way out of. It is worth pausing on what that war actually looked like from the inside of Colombia. For years, ordinary people in Medellin and Bogotá lived with the constant possibility that a car bomb might tear through a street at any moment. Escobar had decided that if the state would not bend to him, he would make the country ungovernable until it did. Judges resigned rather than hear his cases. Newspapers that criticized him saw their offices attacked. An entire nation was effectively held hostage by the will of one man, and for a frightening stretch of time, it genuinely seemed as though he might win. In 1991, he got his wish, briefly. After pressuring the country's leaders to ban extradition, Escobar agreed to surrender, but on his own absurd terms. He was held in a prison he built himself, a luxury compound mockingly nicknamed the Cathedral, complete with a football pitch, a bar, and his own hand-picked guards. It was not a prison so much as a fortress, where he continued running his empire in comfort. The arrangement collapsed when he murdered 2 of his own associates inside its walls. When the government moved to transfer him to a real prison, Escobar simply walked out, on July 22, 1992, through a section of wall built weak for exactly that purpose. What followed was one of the largest manhunts in history. A specialized police unit of more than 600 men hunted him. American electronic surveillance teams and the DEA joined the effort, and a shadowy vigilante group, funded in part by his Cali rivals, waged its own brutal campaign, killing hundreds of people connected to him, tightening the noose from a direction the law never could. For 16 months, Escobar ran, moving from safe house to safe house, his organization crumbling around him. It ended the way these stories so often do, with a single mistake. On December 2nd, 1993, one day after his 44th birthday, he stayed on a phone call a few seconds too long. The surveillance teams traced it. Police closed in on the Medellin house, and in the gunfight that followed, Escobar was shot and killed on a rooftop as he tried to flee across it. The richest, most feared criminal in the world died in his socks on the tiles of an ordinary neighborhood. More than 25,000 people attended his funeral. To much of the world, he was a monster who had bled a nation. To some of the poor he had cultivated with his money, he remained something closer to a hero. Both things were true at once, and that contradiction is exactly why his name still echoes louder than any of the men who came before or after him. 8 men, 1 drug, and a trail of destruction that stretched across decades and continents. Some died in gunfire, some died in prison cells far from home, and the rest are still serving out their sentences on American soil. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.